Hi there, curious people. Welcome back to another episode of Curious People Wanted at the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The format of our program today will be a little different from the usual. With me here is the museum's executive director, Kathy Marr, whom you may remember from other YouTube videos. Today, our focus will mainly be a discussion of the background and history of the museum's relationship with this piece you see here, an ancient Egyptian coffin. Kathy has had a key role in getting our institution on the path to a far more accurate understanding of the coffin and mummy that have been in the museum's care since 1894. So I thought we'd talk about that as well as the earlier history and then some of the more recent projects we've embarked upon that, again, expand our knowledge. The coffin and the mummy it contained were displayed from 1894 until 2010 pretty much continuously during that time. So they have a kind of iconic association with the museum. We still hear from people who recall their first visit to the Barnum decades ago, seeing the unwrapped mummy next to the colorful coffin lid with its hieroglyphs. The body was very dark and in form looked much like a skeleton since most of the bandaging had been removed. That sight definitely made an impression on a lot of kids on their school field trips. And it's interesting to us that there are people who never forgot our mummy's name. Like, it was as if he was part of the community, yeah. Which is unusual, right? Maybe a different perspective on the afterlife of an ancient Egyptian who lived thousands of years ago. People sometimes ask us, how did a mummy and coffin come to be at the Barnum Museum? That's a good question, and we're going to answer that and trace the museum's journey, learning more about our respected ancient person and coffin. We'll highlight some of the milestones in that time frame, which actually now stretches well over a century to about 130 years. Yeah. Kathy has been at the Barnum Museum since 1998.
Not 130 years.
No, not 130 years. And she was really responsible for making contacts with experts and shepherding new studies of the human remains in 2006 and 2010. And that proved informative and quite surprising. So that's really when the museum embarked upon a path of discovery and led to several exciting new projects in the past 10 years that I've had the privilege of working on with experts. So the two of us will share the key milestones in this timeline of the museum's stewardship, which stretches from 1894 to today. Perhaps you could start us off with a little of the beginning when P.T. Barnum's widow made this happen.
Both you and I come from material culture backgrounds, was historians, social historians. So there's a greater context. When I came to the Barnum Museum in 1998, I was aware of the collections at the museum. There were not a lot of artifacts in the museum at that time. It was a museum that was really created by a trade show fabricator. So there was a lot of reproduction material that guided guests through, but there were a good handful of significant objects, one being the Egyptian mummy on the third floor. It was positioned in the museum in the 1980s, late 80s. The re-envisioned Barnum Museum opened in 1989. So when I got here, it was already on display for 10 years, to your point about artifacts being on display for a long time. So, you know, as a social historian, I'm thinking this is the Barnum Museum. Museums at that time, there was no digital world at that time. You know, let me bring you back to that moment. Right. We had to do all kinds of hard research, handwrite letters, the email access was just growing, so there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of accessibility to immediate research. So my initial thought was, is this real? You know, because of how you described the way it looked. And it sort of perplexed me, but I had my hands full at that point. I was the only professional curatorial staff that had to deal with everything. But that stayed in my mind, and I knew that the mummy needed to be addressed in some capacity. So with that, I finally found, because again, archives were not digitized, so there were just files and records on objects that were in different drawers in different places. I had to bring all of that together and then find specifically all of the files that addressed the mummy's history.
Right.
So this took a lot of time, and of course you have to transcribe some handwriting correspondence between the early people at the museum. So to your point, what we came to find, and you can help me tell this story, the fascination with Egyptian culture goes way back in time. It didn't happen with just King Tut. The Napoleonic campaigns and the excavation of Egyptian tombs, it influenced everything. It influenced dress, it influenced furniture, fashionable tastes at that time. So this goes back to the early 1800s. We did know, I realized, that Barnum did have an interest in displaying Egyptian mummies.
Right.
You see that in the 1840s with his Peruvian mummies on exhibition at the American Museum with the Fiji mermaid, right?
Right, the ads.
The ads, exactly. It did make total sense, and it was completely plausible that the Barnum Museum at this moment in time had a mummy. So where did it come from? So your point. So we did find records that go back. So Mr. Barnum passes away in 1891. Something that people don't often realize, he dies in 1891. People firmly put Barnum in the 20th century, which is just not the case. So he never was in our Barnum Museum. We do know, because soon to be a National Historic Landmark, that Barnum had a glorious picture on the front page of the Bridgeport Standard, I think it was, of this museum, illustrating what's to come, the Bridgeport Scientific Society, the Fairfield County Historical Society. So it was all intended to be a museum, for academic research and dissemination of knowledge. With that, he passes away. But the community, the Bridgeport community, rose and said, we're going to complete his vision, for him. This is really the only building that's still standing with integrity, with a connection to this iconic American figure. His second wife, Nancy Fish, really wanted to maintain his legacy embedded within the museum and was at the opening in 1893. Mm-hmm. It was very common to do continental and European and Eastern tours in the 19th century, and she was the one who actually went to Egypt.
Yeah, after Barnum's death, a respectful amount of time later, she decided to go do some world travels, and when she was in Egypt, I'm sure she talked to people about her husband's legacy gift to Bridgeport, the Barnum Institute. And as far as we know, this is recorded in some newspaper articles, the American consulate gave her the coffin and mummy so that she could present them to the Bridgeport Scientific Society. This is right, at the beginning of the Barnum Institute's history. Yeah. So we know that they were shipped from Egypt to the United States, and in August of 1894, some of the members of the Scientific Society and the Medical Society, who was actually also in the building, they unwrapped the mummified bodies.
Which was not an unusual thing.
Not at all. Interestingly, this is just on the cusp of when X-rays were invented. Yeah. But it wasn't possible at that moment in time, so they did what many others had done. They unwound the bandages to see what this mummified human being looked like.
And also looking for treasures. There would be scarabs, there would be relics, and that was seen as the valuable treasure. Very often in museums all over the world at that time, the human remains were discarded.
That's right.
And the treasures were maintained in the collection, so we're very fortunate.
Absolutely. Yeah, there wasn't, for the most part, a lot of respect for the body as a person. They did find this small bead net, no other ornaments that we know of. We don't get a lot of information at this time, just what was in a newspaper article. It did say the individuals who were involved in this unwrapping process, but no real record of, details that we would like to know. Unfortunately, just have to be satisfied with what the newspaper reported in August of 1894.
Yeah. That's good. That's a basis for us to start,
right.
Our research. So that's a wonderful thing.
Right. We feel pretty certain that the mummy and coffin were displayed continuously from that point until maybe about 1934, when the Barnum Institute ceased and the city of Bridgeport took over the building, mainly for offices.
And that was because of the Depression.
Yeah.
That was a social impact that there was no way around.
Right.
So,
Yeah, the societies really couldn't keep up their membership and so on. So the city of Bridgeport took over the historic building, and mainly it was for their offices. The collections were then moved to the top floor and kind of all crowded together in the space that actually had been used as the Institute's lecture hall, their program space. So unfortunately, we don't have any information about the mummy and coffin from those first decades of the 20th century. But then in the 1960s, when the city offices moved out and the full building returned to being a museum again, we kind of pick up the trail. So we have a few pieces of correspondence showing that the director of the Barnum was communicating with other institutions about the mummy and coffin, and that included New York University, the museums at UPenn, and Yale University. Kathy, maybe you'd like to share one of these letters that we have. It's kind of special.
We'll definitely do a close-up of them. But in going through those files that we were talking about, we were fortunate to unearth. It's a October 1967 letter that was written to the director, Ken Holmes, at the time. Address here at the Barnum Museum is still the same, Main Street, downtown Bridgeport, and it was sent to a Nicholas Millett. And Mr. Millett was asked really to assess the mummy coffin. It doesn't appear that any of the language in the correspondence deals with the human remains at all, but it was, can we read anything, the hieroglyphics that are present on the coffin? And what's wonderful, because this is like a manual typewriter, okay, that to describe some of the hieroglyphics, he actually drew little illustrations of some of the, and to me that's a treasure because he was looking at things so closely. I was thrilled to find a letter that had, finally identified and revealed to us that there have been scholars looking at this. What dawned on me when I came to the museum, none of these scholars really made the connection that, okay, Egyptian relics were an industry throughout the 19th century. And anybody could go to Egypt, pick their coffin, pick their mummy, and put them together, and they didn't start the afterlife together necessarily. If they fit, they went on their way together. And that was really not addressed in the 1960s, early 70s assessment of our object and remains. So there was no way to really say, it's like, well, yeah, the body and the coffin actually are the same, from the same moment in time.
That was assumed that they belonged.
Yeah. So, right, so that's another 30 years away from that. But at least this gave us information that there was recognition of the importance of this object in our collection at its time.
This gentleman, Mr. Millett, interpreted the glyphs and gave the museum the name Payeb or Paib. And so 1967 is kind of when we say that name was canonized for the remains, the mummified individual, and the coffin. So for decades, this has been Paib.
Paib, a male priest from Upper Egypt from about 2,500 years ago. Correct. Died at around 60 years old. That was the story.
Right.
That continued.
So this is, according to this scholar, probably early 26th dynasty. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is foundational for us understanding, you know, people's interpretation of what we have here. So the other correspondence we have concerns restoration work that was done on the coffin close in time, around 1968. That was done by a graduate student under supervision at New York University in their conservation department. Again, no report, which is frustrating. I did contact them to see if somewhere in their files they might have it, but alas, not. In our correspondence, though, gotta love this, the expense, the students' expense for materials and travel amounted to $46.33. So,
which doesn't even pay for the gas to get scholars here today. Yeah.
So, and then there's also correspondence with the University Museum at University of Pennsylvania. Yeah. The director wanted to know, was the body in good shape, or did they need to do something to stabilize it? Some experts came from UPenn and looked and said it was fine. There was no work of any kind done on the mummified body, but just on the coffin here.
Which was probably good.
So we're going to kind of fast forward here about 30 years. When you came on board in the late 1990s, that was about a decade after the renovation of the museum, which included new exhibitions and display cases. And I know that you were not happy with the way the mummy and coffin were being displayed. Can you explain what had been done that was causing harm and really undermining the long-term preservation?
I would not call myself a conservator, but I spent a lot of time in graduate school in the conservation laboratory, and you know, the rule is do no harm. You know, better is the enemy of good. So not touching it until we had a sense of what was going on. But what I did know, there were certain things that I was able to implement that were low impact and non-intrusive at all. And the big one for me was getting the lights out.
Yeah.
As much as possible. The way, and maybe some of you watching will remember, the mummy was in an exhibition case that was not climate controlled, and it had basic halogen lights, also not ideal, changed the lights out, but also every day these two big doors would open up to the glorious, you know, south-facing turret.
Sunlight.
Beating down at candlefoot power that my meter couldn't even read. And for those of you to know, museums are often very dim because there's a certain level of light called candlefoot power that any object can take. Metal can handle more than textile. Basically, a mummy, something that is as old as this, should be in dark all the time unless there's an activated trigger that would turn, illuminate slowly, and then go off with motion. So over 200-foot candle power was coming down, beating down on the mummy. And I came in and I told the staff, because often curators and registrar run the show because the object needs, you know, to be cared for, because we work for the generations to come, not necessarily for the moment. And we just shut the doors, just leave them shut, and I locked them. They weren't necessary to any kind of passage, but it was one of the most damaging. There's no way back from light damage.
Right.
It's cumulative, it is not reversible. So that done was done. So we were able to get the lights down as much as possible. And then I was able to find a way to stabilize the relative humidity situation in the building as well. Something that both of these things we're completely fixing now with the new Barnum Museum. And it's complicated, it's expensive, and that was probably one of the reasons why they didn't go ahead and do this in the 80s. They just simply didn't have enough money to address the environmental stabilization needs for the objects.
Right, so they kind of put display first, and I remember you telling me about the fluorescent lighting right around.
So that was the most alarming thing, and only when I got there, only one strip worked. So below the base of the coffin, it was fluorescent light bulbs, long fluorescent light bulbs that had hot pink tubing going out of them. And I know I'm laughing, and I'm going to encourage our production team to leave my laughing in. But literally, it was hot pink fluorescent lights going underneath them. I don't know who was approving this, but it was like, turn them off, take them, out. So we were able to just stop that kind of behavior. And then other objects, because it was a room where there were a lot of biological specimens, and I had to take a lot of things off display and contain them because they were being harmed with the fluctuations over time. So it was a matter of getting everything to a baseline and stabilizing it in those early days until I was able to assemble a team, raise the funds to bring in more experts to say, it's like, okay, this is what you got, this is what we got to do.
You felt quite motivated to do something positive, not only to implement best practices in the exhibition, but then also to learn more about the mummy and the coffin.
Yeah. So that was a really big concern. What are we really looking at here? And even putting authenticity, on the table, that's a question. Time was right, and there was a very popular National Geographic show called The Mummy Roadshow.
Right.
And it was always in the back of my head. And I was like, geez, who knows? These shows have taken off since that time. But the Mummy Roadshow was really kind of interesting. A couple of scholars traipsing around the world, looking at different mummies and talking about them. It seemed really smart and engaging. Yeah. At that point, I was also the director of the museum. And there was an assistant helping with curatorial. I don't know if it was Google search engine at the time or if it was Ask Jeeves. We're really dating ourselves here. But I said to her, it's like, can you Google, the Mummy Roadshow and see what comes up? Lo and behold, she comes back to me and she says, you are not going to believe it. They are bioanthropologist imaging department at Quinnipiac University, a half mile up the road from the Barnum Museum. And I'm like, what? So totally astonished. It's like, well, okay, that's the sign. So we emailed them, thinking it's like, okay, let's see, where this gets us. This is about 2005. I think this is about 2005, 2006. And not even 24 hours later, we got a response from Ron Beckett and Jerry Conlog that was like, we'll be there tomorrow. And sure enough, they were.
So these are professors from Quinnipiac University in Hampden.
In Hampden, Connecticut.
Fairly close by.
Yeah. And they said, prior to me coming to the Barnum Museum, really, because I never received the letters, that they had just in their basic interest of ancient relics and mummies, that they had reached out to the Barnum Museum because they knew that there was a relic in the collection, and they never heard back. So I kind of look back and I think it's like, well, that was the opportunity for that moment in time, our moment in time, to jump in and really engage them and make the Quinnipiac program an integral part of the Barnum Museum's research and study for the advancement of our our artifacts, our pieces, our collections items. So I don't think a month's gone by where we haven't spoken to them in some capacity or referred to them in some capacity, so like almost 20 years.
But just to clarify, the Barnum Museum mummy and coffin were not actually they were not on the Mummy Roadshow.
No, they never were on the Mummy Roadshow.
But the gentlemen that you worked with, Jerry Conlog and Ron Beckett, were the co-hosts of that program
and
for
that
years.
Point, I think the show finished its production at that point too. But they, as researchers, were certainly in the prime of their of their lives. And what we decided to do was create a plan, a smart plan that was going to assess the situation as it was. They saw the unusual case lid and base that the mummy was on, so we had to make sure to even just take the lid, the plexi lid off, required 6 people to do it safely. So, I mean, there was a lot of consideration to, as you said, best practices. And then what we did want to do is X-ray the mummy in place to see what we were looking at with the body. I mean, you know, you look at Barnum, you take it back, you know, to the 1840s, and the VG mermaid was a constructed body. Are we looking at real human remains here, or is this, you know, something? So sure enough, we did have a lot of media at that time come to really be a part of this story, because this is a, you know, an ancient relic from Egypt is a big story. It's a global story. Yeah. You know, we all have a passion and a fascination with Egyptian culture to this day. So sure enough, the X-rays proved that we were in fact looking at a real mummy. Mummified remains, and from that moment it's like, okay, enough for today. Let's set up a plan to have a series of CAT scans and MRIs done at a facility that had this equipment, because you can't bring that to the museum. So that was the next step.
Did you also, or did Ron Beckett do an endoscopy at the museum here?
We did. That was done primarily on the skull. That actually is when we realized that the cribiform, part of the mummification process to get the brain out, is you go up a nostril. And as Ron said, it was like a misfire, and they broke the bone. So the mummy has a very large cavity where the brain was actually taken from the head. And that was primarily to see, and interestingly, that was really to see what the resin situation was in the skull. And we were actually able to compare the X-rays to King Tut's, and whereas you see the resin in the skull of King Tut's, that his head must have been tilted way back, whereas our mummy was not, the head was not tilted as far back, so the resin is in a different configuration. What they also realized during that time, the mummification process did not align with our coffin story of a 2,500-year-old mummification, that the incisions were in different places, and they discovered that there were packages put back into the chest cavity, which also doesn't align with the 2,500-year-old mummification. It's an earlier process.
They were able to figure that out with the endoscope.
Yes.
And that's for people who might not be aware, it's kind of a tube with a camera in it that allows you to go inside these spaces within the body to see inside.
Right, very unintrusive. You know, it was a very small mechanism with a light on it, so you could see. There looked like there were some salt deposits, according to Ron and Jerry, but there were very distinctive, you know, mummified packages inside the chest. So what's that? That's something that we have to look at more, that the X-rays and the cameras could not tell us. So
you had a next step.
So we had a next step. So now the plot thickens, right? So now we've just, it's like, okay, we're going to do this research. We're going to have so much more knowledge about them. That just took us another level deeper. Okay. Now there's more to discover. So it was exciting. It was exciting.
And so where did this now take you?
Working with Ron and Jerry, and they have contacts all over the world, really, with X-raying and imaging laboratories, and we were able to coordinate with a local imaging lab who do live people.
Next town over.
Next town over. So they actually kindly allowed us to say, it's like, okay, we're going to prepare a day, you know, have the site somewhat quiet, and we'll bring the mummy in. And it was very non-intrusive as well. There was a lot of care into how we're going to transport, because it was a transport of human remains, so we had to get insurance companies involved. The insurance company basically said, it's like, okay, you want to move this, you need a police escort, and you, meaning me, the curator, was not allowed to leave it.
So this is more than an ordinary doctor's appointment.
This was much more than an ordinary doctor's appointment. So we did, and thank you, Bridgeport Police Department, we had a police escort there, stayed at the facility while all the work was happening, and then back. And it was a long day. And it was funny because it was a long time ago. I must have looked very young back then, because as Ron and Jerry, we were entering the facility with the police department. One of the people there said to me, "No, you can't come in." I was singled out. It's like, no, this is only for, and I'm like, well, then we're going home. So in we went with an entourage of different scientists. I believe that Ron and Jerry had some of their graduate students that were there, and we did two things. We did the CAT scans. We also did an MRI while we were there. MRIs, and I am not a scientist, but it's based on moisture, reflection of moisture, and the mummy was a ghost.
Yeah.
In an MRI.
No moisture.
None whatsoever, but it was somewhat ominous and interesting to actually see an MRI where you see something and it doesn't appear. But the scanning was enormously successful, and we were able to really take the research literally layer by layer by layer into the specimen that we were looking at.
So a CT scan is computed tomography, and so it's sort of images that are like in slices. Yeah. And so what you learned, or what our experts learned as they saw those slices.
What they learned, what they were thinking was that one of the packages might be a falcon, that it might have been a mummified bird that was put back into for ritualistic purposes. That intrigued everybody. The media got a hold of that, and that became a headline.
Because that would be really rare.
That would have been extremely rare. I think it was Ron who said that, and he goes, "I had no idea that was going to be the thing that went viral." But there you have it, right? So, but it kept the Barnum Museum mummy, project in the spotlight, in the eye, so more and more people were becoming aware of it. And I will point out, there are not many mummies in Connecticut.
No.
Are an hour away. In New York, there's plenty, but in Connecticut, it's a very rare thing. But the thing that most captivated me is, for all the years I'd been at the Barnum Museum, for all the years the mummy had been, it's 130 years at the Barnum Museum, the reflection of the hieroglyphics on the coffin spoke to a 60-year-old male priest from Egypt who died of about 60. What we learned was, in fact, it was more like a 40-year-old woman who had nothing to do with the story that we've been telling for years and years and years. I was astounded.
I can't imagine.
I was astounded. I will admit, I put pink balloons outside the museum the next day because it was just like, we're giving somebody their life back.
Yeah, an identity.
It was giving them an identity for all of these years, and it was such a joy to be able to share that with, and we're still sharing that story.
Yes.
All these years later, that we were actually able to give her some presence and recognize, the life and the times of Egyptian women. Another thing that really became evident too, because of the hieroglyphic, because of the incisions of the mummification, it was more reflective of a mummy that was 4,000 years old.
Huge difference. Huge difference. Yeah.
I mean, think about what life in the year 500 was like, compared to us today.
Right.
So, I mean, you have that enormous time span. So, she walked this planet an extraordinarily long time ago. And you think of what the pyramids were kind of, a current event. Really, at the time, in some capacity, the Sphinx, all of the things that make ancient Egypt miraculous to us was happening in her lifetime.
Right. Now, as I understand it, the skull, the shape of the skull, and the shape of the pelvis would be clues to the sex of the individual, because there are characteristics more associated with male skulls, female skulls, and obviously the same with the pelvis. But they're not absolutes, because there's variation, so you can't be absolutely certain. So at this point in 2006, it's like, well, we're pretty sure this is a woman, not a man, and that she was younger, not 60, but not absolutely
Not absolute,
sure.
and that was the fantastic thing about working with Ron and Jerry is their network of scholars and scientists is broad and deep. That a lot of people were getting involved to look and assess. And even, yes, because the size of her pelvis was in question, and it was a conversation back and forth until we landed more firmly where we are today. But even what was determined was a severe periodontal disease. And the abscesses would have gone up into her brain. Again, as you said, absolute, it's not absolute, but it's very likely that she might have died of severe periodontal disease. I think that there was originally 9 abscesses, and then Jerry looked again, it's like, geez, that's really 11. So she had to have been in extraordinary pain. And actually even said, it's like with something like that, her breath was probably, you know, just horrible. So she was living a hard life.
Yeah, although one of our experts, Dr. Alan Lurie, mentioned or said to me, you know, it gets to a point where the nerves have died, so the person's not feeling pain. I mean, I can't,
that's
you know,
interesting,
yeah, it's so many interesting things to learn about this. But now, so you have a lot of information, not absolute, but Jerry Conlog and Ron Beckett thought maybe there's an opportunity to get better quality, higher resolution CT scanning images. So how did that happen?
So from my understanding is that Quinnipiac University aligned with Toshiba. And Toshiba had was producing very, very high level scanning equipment and donated quite an expensive state-of-the-art equipment to the university. So it would have increased the resolution of the scans that we had tenfold. So they came back and it literally it's like, you know, we have an opportunity. So can we do it again? And everything went so seamlessly the first time, and everybody was wonderful. I said, you know what, we'll do it, but can we bring a class from the bioengineering school? It was the school.
Agri-science?
Thank you.
Agri-science high school.
We can edit that. The agri-science biotechnology, thank you. My son went there. So the Agri-Science Biotechnology School, which is really a magnet school for the regional students who want to pursue this field. They're part of the FFA. And the students are really serious about pursuing this kind of information. So it's a university, it's Quinnipiac. They were like, absolutely. So we mustered up a group of students to attend the scanning and be a part of the press conference that we were collaborating with Quinnipiac on. And it was extraordinary to have the young students, the scientists, actually you know, when people look at the Barnum Museum, you don't think that we do STEAM, you know, or STEM, you know, we really do. It was a day of once in a lifetime.
Right, absolutely extraordinary experience for those students and adults too. Yeah, very special.
Yeah, so they were in time. So similarly, we went through the same process, you know, reaching out. The first thing you do is make sure the insurance company will allow you to transport the object, and they agreed, same thing, police escort, can't leave it. This time, though, what was interesting is because the media interest in this had grown, we had an entourage of cameras following our little convoy with, you know, photographing the
paparazzi,
right, all the way up to the Quinnipiac campus. So similarly, now she, you know, is taken, and there was a little bit of disappointment because there was no need to take her out of the packaging. So everything was packaged very carefully, but because the scanning equipment is so high, it could go right through. So there were some people who were disappointed. They wanted to actually see the mummy, but for us, it's like, if we don't have to do this, we don't do it. Sorry, you know.
Yeah.
So we went ahead and we did that. We were able to go through it and scan. It was, oh my goodness, what did we get?
I think 80, was
Yeah.
it 80 slice or something like that?
It was extraordinary.
Far finer slicing than the previous one done in 2006,
Correct.
which means you getting clearer images then.
Correct.
And you can see a lot more detail. And as I understand, that really helped to determine that
it helped us.
This was a woman.
It was a woman. There was no falcon.
Right.
You know, the packages were in there, and they were probably mummified organs, you know, of hers, placed back in. A typical practice of that. Then we were able to really see what was happening with the you know, how degraded her teeth were and what the story is, and the maxillofacial forensic surgeon
Dr.
came
Lori,
in
yeah.
and did a presentation on that too. So we were really able to speak, you know, and sort of what's interesting, part of the future of the Barnum Museum, it's going to be, you know, make sure you brush your teeth, and our town school, Bridgeport, you know, University is one of the first dental schools, so we will have a dental section in our gift shop.
Dental hygiene, that's
dental
the thing, the
hygiene.
School of Dental Hygiene.
Right,
Yeah.
so brush your teeth. So going through this process, it's given us so much more, not just, hey, it's a cool mummy in a museum. Now there's a life associated to it. And I think one of the most wonderful partnerships, friendships that we've made with the Cairo Museum is Dr. Sahar Salim, who really is an expert and did the program on the lives and roles of women in ancient Egypt. I didn't realize how progressive thinking women were in society at that time. I encourage you to watch it and be inspired.
Yeah, women were valued
Highly
in the
valued.
society, which was
Highly
unlike the Greek and Roman cultures.
Yeah.
So the imaging work and the valuable input of experts, those 4 years, 2006 to 2010, really pushed us miles forward from where our knowledge was between 1894 and 2005.
It's amazing.
That's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And then in June of 2010, just 6 months after the trip to Quinnipiac for the high-resolution imaging, the museum had a very major problem on its hands, the impact of a tornado strike. So from there on out, everything we did changed. I came on board after the tornado, and of course, one of the major concerns was protecting the mummy and the coffin. And we were very fortunate in that we could call on colleagues at Yale Peabody Museum, Catherine Cease, who is a conservator, and Roger Colton, a senior collections manager there. They came out and took a look, and after a discussion what to do, it was decided, well, we should have custom crates made for the body and the two halves of the coffin, and it all should be moved to a safer place. So that was ideal for us, because ultimately, less than 3 years later, these were on display in Yale Peabody's exhibition called Echoes of Egypt. So that was a silver lining to that dark tornado cloud, was that that the mummy and coffin had a new role to play.
An exposure, and our gratitude to the Yale team and the Quinnipiac team has no limit. We are so thankful, because they not only helped us care for the mummy, they also took it to their facilities, all of the biological specimens, so they could be properly cared for in environmentally controlled environments. So that was a a huge blessing to the museum to not have to worry about these things, because there was so much more to worry about during that time.
That exhibition ran from April of 2013 to January of 2014. I believe you can still see images and text online at the Yale Peabody website, and there's a catalog too. So now, jumping ahead to December of 2018, our friend Jerry Conlog approached us with an idea. And I will never forget the day I came into work looking at my email, the inbox, and I found an email that had the subject heading, "Looking for Skulls." Kind of woke me up. It was really an attention grabber. So, you know, what was really being asked or sought was not skulls per se, but high resolution imaging data that could be used to replicate, to make 3D prints of skulls. So Jerry had connected us with a gentleman, Joe Mullins, who is a forensic specialist. He does 2D forensic images and sculpture as well. And he works for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Virginia, but he does come up to New York once a year to teach a workshop at the New York Academy of Art. It's a sculpture workshop, and they're actually trying to solve cold cases, you know, crime cases. But they had done some historical work too. So Jerry connected Joe Mullins with us because Jerry knew that we did have that high resolution imaging data. And sure enough, we were able to have a 3D skull print made, and that became the basis of this clay bust. The opportunity to see what our young woman actually had looked like, or a very close approximation, scientifically done, just blew our minds, I think.
It was astonishing after, you know, my some 20 years, really just learning something new about her day after day, to finally actually look into somebody else's eyes.
Who lived 4,000 years ago.
4,000 years ago. You know, and there's all creative, you know, liberties with that creation, but it was an extraordinary moment to actually see something more than the dried remains, you know, of the skull.
We were going to have finally an idea of what a woman who lived 4,000 years ago looked like. Kathy, I want to know what your reaction was when you saw that sculpted face at the end of that week-long workshop. What did you think?
So I'll share a human moment with you. It was fascinating to see, and you were actually there. You were in New York when it was happening and reporting back what's going on. So that was exciting. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. So when we decided to make the very quick video, it's like 2 minutes long, that showed Joe Mullins really building the face and the muscles and creating it. You and I were watching that video together because it happened some months after the completed form. It almost brought us both to tears. I will share a human moment with you because between the music and the slow, you know, the slow introduction to her that way was so compelling, you know, and so emotionally, you know, inspiring. And then there she was. And it just said, this has been years of work and research and caring and being committed, you know, to this particular artifact, and then to a life story that there she finally was, that you and I were both like, oh my God, this is so unprofessional, but it was real. It was a real emotional moment.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And then the last day of the workshop, we had it live streamed here at the museum, and students from Housatonic Community College came, and again from the high school.
Agri-science school,
Yeah, so that was an exciting time too. This opportunity to recreate the bust has really been one of the drivers to help us advance our understanding of the individual and of the mummified individual. Has been with us for over a century, and finding ways to share that with audiences. It's really transformed our interpretation of her. She was largely treated as an object. Now she could be interpreted more as an individual who had a life, you know, in the very
Yes.
distant past, but this was a human being who had a life.
Yeah.
And that's been an extraordinary, I think, journey for us. And we've had the good fortune to continue working with experts like Jerry Conlog and Dr. Lurie, and to be able to be introduced to a present-day Egyptian woman who has studied many Egyptian mummies. That is Dr. Sahar Salim, who you mentioned, who teaches at Cairo University. So her expertise and the range and depth of her knowledge have really been invaluable in helping us get a better picture of the life of a young woman, and adding her insights also to the CT scans that we had done. I mean, you know, experts do have different perspectives on that kind of data. It's not just like, here's the answer. So that's an interesting process too. And she gave us a great name. We had wanted to have a name since obviously Paib was no longer appropriate.
Right.
And Dr. Salim was able to suggest a variety of names that would have been culturally appropriate and to the time period, 4,000 years ago. There were some she said, maybe you shouldn't choose these because they have somehow acquired like kind of negative connotations,
Words,
you know.
right.
So anyway, we had a consensus that the name should be Ippy, which means, you know, most favorite, and that's very appropriate for our museum.
Yes, and Ippy, Ebby, pardon our pronunciation if you're watching and you know, but we felt that giving her an identity and a name was the right thing, that it's no longer just an artifact, just an object. It is part of the Barnum Museum, but a story, a human story.
We'll never know her exact identity. This is how we can help audiences understand her life, you know, with a name and a face now. And, you know, we've also learned a lot more about this coffin thanks to Dr. Kia Johnston, whose recent dissertation at UC Berkeley included our coffin in her study of coffins that were made in Akhmim. That was about 2,500 years ago. So we'll keep on sharing what we learn. It gets more exciting all the time. We've been putting together a number of videos on the different facets.
Yes, we have. So if you're a student out there who is completely captivated with this story, I encourage you to pursue your dreams, because you might be the people sitting in these chairs in 10, 15, 20 years, and you will be able to take this research to a completely different level as technology advances.
Yes, and we'd certainly like to express our gratitude and thanks to Connecticut Humanities for their funding of various stages of this project. It's been a great assistance, and we're very appreciative of that. To sum up, I think you can see we take the museum's stewardship role seriously, and we especially want to kind of shift the thinking or the narrative about this topic away from the traditional view of a mummified person as a museum object. Rather, we are the custodians of Ippy's mummy, her mummy, who would continue her life in an afterlife. And that was the point of mummification and the ritual burial objects, helping the person make that transition to another life. So we want to respect the cultural perspectives of the ancient Egyptians. Kathy, thank you for speaking with me about this long journey, which will continue.
Thank you, yes, very much. It's been a pleasure being on the journey with you for so many years.
It has. It's certainly involved treasured memories all the way along. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this and that you will stay curious until I see you again on a new episode.